The judge's daughter never screamed when he came to her room at night, and that silence would cost her everything. The Texas sun bore down on Dallas like the judgment of an angry god, turning the red dirt roads into rivers of dust that choked the lungs and stung the eyes. In the summer of 1901, the city was a contradiction wrapped in Sunday sermons and Saturday night sins, where men built fortunes on cattle and cotton while their wives pretended not to notice the bruises on their housemaids' arms. On Commerce Street, where the wealthiest families built their monuments to prosperity, stood a 3-story Victorian mansion that seemed to swallow the light. Judge Theodore Hartwell's residence was the envy of respectable society. White columns rose like prayer hands toward heaven, wraparound porches promised cool refuge from the relentless heat, and immaculate gardens bloomed despite the drought that had turned neighboring yards to dust. Inside those walls lived 17-year-old Catherine Hartwell, and she had learned long ago that beauty was just another cage. Before continuing, check right now if you're already subscribed to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see if there's someone from my city here. The morning began like all the others. Catherine woke before dawn to the sound of her father's footsteps in the hallway, that distinctive pattern of heel-toe that sent ice through her veins no matter how thick the summer heat. She counted his steps. 12 to reach her door. A pause. Then continuing past, down the stairs to his study, where he would pray for an hour before breakfast. She released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Miss Catherine? The soft knock belonged to Mary, the housekeeper who had worked for the Hartwells for 3 years, the longest anyone had lasted. Your father wants you downstairs in 20 minutes. Full dress, he said. We have visitors coming. Catherine rose from her bed, her nightgown sticking to her skin in the pre-dawn humidity. Through her window, Dallas was beginning to stir. Wagons rattled down Commerce Street carrying goods to market. The saloon 3 blocks over would still be cleaning up from last night's revelries. The First Presbyterian Church's bell tower caught the first rays of sun, and Catherine wondered, not for the first time, if God could see into this house, or if he looked away like everyone else. 20 minutes. She moved to her wardrobe, her fingers automatically selecting the high-necked blue dress her father preferred. Not the green one, never the green one, not since the incident with Reverend Thompson's son at the church social. Her father had burned that dress in the fireplace while explaining in his calm, measured voice how modest girls didn't attract improper attention, how she must have done something to encourage the boys' advances. How disappointed he was that she would bring shame to their family name. She had been 14. The boy had simply asked her about a book she was reading. Miss Catherine, you need help with those buttons? Mary appeared in the doorway, her dark eyes carefully avoiding Catherine's in the mirror. There was an art to service in the Hartwell household. See nothing, hear nothing, survive until your contract ended. Please. Catherine stood still while Mary's practiced fingers worked the pearl buttons up her spine. In the mirror, she studied her own face as if it belonged to a stranger. Pale skin that rarely saw sun. Dark hair pulled back so tightly it made her scalp ache. Eyes that had learned to look at nothing too directly, to never hold a gaze too long. At 17, she looked like a ghost of herself. He seems pleased today. Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. Got word yesterday that the Thompson case went his way. Big settlement. Catherine's stomach twisted. Judge Hartwell was always most dangerous when he was pleased. The dining room was a shrine to respectability. Silver service gleamed on the sideboard, inherited from her grandmother. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their disapproving eyes following her to her seat. The table could accommodate 12, but only 2 place settings were ever laid. Her mother's chair had been removed 7 years ago after the fever took her. Catherine was 11 when she'd asked what would happen to the chair. Your mother has left this house, her father had said, his hand gripping her shoulder with bruising force. And you will never speak of her again. Do you understand? She understood. She understood that her mother had been another prisoner who had found the only escape available. Judge Hartwell entered precisely at 6 o'clock. He was a tall man, 52 years old but straight-backed as a soldier, with silver threading through his dark hair and a face that newspapers described as distinguished. His eyes were the color of flint, and they assessed Catherine the way he might evaluate a witness on the stand. "Catherine." He took his seat at the head of the table. "You look proper this morning. That dress suits you." "Thank you, Father." Her voice was steady. She had practiced this voice since childhood, the one that showed no fear, no anger, no feeling at all. "Senator Patterson and his wife will be joining us for dinner this evening. The senator is considering me for appointment to the state Supreme Court." He unfolded his napkin with precise movements. "You will attend, of course, and you will make a favorable impression." "Of course, Father. You will speak only when addressed. You will smile, but not too broadly. You will demonstrate the cultivation and refinement expected of a judge's daughter." His eyes fixed on her like a hawk watching a mouse. "You will not embarrass me." The unspoken threat hung in the air like smoke. Catherine had learned at 12 what happened when she embarrassed him. The locked room. The biblical verses read aloud for hours. The certainty that no one would come, no one would help, no one would even wonder where she was. Mary brought breakfast, fresh eggs, bacon, biscuits with butter and jam. Catherine's stomach rebelled at the sight, but she forced herself to eat. Her father watched every bite, his satisfaction evident when she cleaned her plate. "Excellent. A woman who doesn't eat properly suggests either vanity or illness, and both are unacceptable in this house." He dabbed his mouth with his napkin. "After breakfast, you'll spend the morning in prayer and scripture study. I've left the appropriate passages in your room. This afternoon, you'll help Mary prepare for this evening. I expect perfection." "Yes, Father." The morning prayer sessions had begun when she was 13. 2 hours in her room with the Bible open, her father checking periodically to ensure she was reading the verses he'd assigned. Always the same themes: obedience, submission, the wickedness of women who strayed from God's path. He would quiz her afterward, and wrong answers meant starting over. She had memorized them all. Ephesians 5:22, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." Proverbs 31, the entire chapter about the virtuous woman. 1 Timothy 2:11, "Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness." The verses had become walls, each one another brick in the prison her father had built. As Catherine climbed the stairs to her room, the house seemed to hold its breath. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny souls trying to escape. From outside came the sounds of a city coming alive. Horses' hooves on packed dirt, merchants calling their wares, children laughing on their way to school. Catherine had not attended school since she was 12. Her father had decided that formal education was unnecessary for a girl, and besides, he could provide better instruction at home. What he provided was isolation. Her room was beautiful and suffocating. A 4-poster bed with white lace curtains, a writing desk where she was allowed no correspondence, bookshelves filled with volumes her father had selected, sermons, moral instruction, poetry deemed appropriate for young ladies. Nothing that might give her dangerous ideas about the world beyond these walls. On the desk lay the Bible, open to 1 Peter, chapter 3. Her father's handwriting marked the passage he wanted her to study. "Wives, in the same way submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that, if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives." Catherine sat at the desk, but she didn't read. Instead, she stared out the window at the street below, where a young woman about her age walked freely, carrying a basket to market. The woman wore a simple dress, her hair loose in the heat, and she was smiling at something her companion said. Catherine watched until they turned the corner and disappeared. Freedom looked like that, she thought, like choosing your own path on a Tuesday morning. A knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Catherine?" It was Mary again. "Your father wants me to tell you that Reverend Parker will be joining you for luncheon. He'll be arriving at noon." Catherine's blood turned to ice water. Reverend Josiah Parker was her father's closest friend, the pastor of First Presbyterian, and the only person besides her father allowed extended private time with her. His visits always left her feeling as if spiders were crawling beneath her skin. "Thank you, Mary," he said. Mary hesitated at the door. He said to wear the white dress, the one with the lace collar. Of course, the white dress that made her look younger, more innocent, her father's favorite costume for her. The morning dragged past like a wounded animal. Catherine forced herself through the scripture readings, her eyes following words that had lost all meaning through repetition. The Texas heat pressed against the windows, turning her room into an oven despite the shade. Sweat trickled down her spine, but she didn't move. Movement meant time passing, and time passing meant noon approaching. At 11:45, she changed into the white dress. It buttoned high at the throat and fell to her ankles, every inch of her covered except her hands and face. She braided her hair and pinned it up, making herself smaller, less visible, less real. Reverend Parker arrived precisely at noon. Catherine heard his booming voice from her room, greeting her father with the hearty camaraderie of men who believed themselves righteous. Their laughter drifted up the stairs like smoke from a fire. "Catherine!" Her father's voice cut through the house like a blade. "Come greet our guest." She descended the stairs with measured steps, her hand light on the banister, her eyes downcast. The Reverend stood in the foyer, his bulk filling the space, his face flushed from the heat or excitement or both. He was a large man, running to fat in middle age, with thick fingers that were always slightly damp and breath that smelled of tobacco and something sour. "Little Catherine." He spread his arms as if to embrace her. She endured his hug, her body rigid, breathing through her mouth. "My goodness, child, you grow more lovely each time I see you. The Lord has blessed your father with a beautiful daughter." "Thank you, Reverend." The words tasted like ashes. Her father watched the exchange with approval. "Catherine has been studying 1 Peter this morning. Perhaps you could discuss the scripture over lunch?" "Delightful. Yes, the submission of wives to husbands, a vital lesson for young women preparing for marriage." The Reverend's hand settled on Catherine's shoulder, heavy and hot. "Shall we dine?" Lunch was an ordeal. Catherine sat between the two men, a butterfly pinned to display. They discussed her as if she weren't present, debating her spiritual development, her proper role, her future. The Reverend suggested more intensive religious instruction. Her father agreed. They talked about potential suitors, men from good families who would appreciate a properly trained wife. "Of course, Catherine requires more guidance before she's ready for marriage," her father said, cutting his roast beef with surgical precision. "Young women today receive such corrupting influences. I've kept her sheltered, but one can never be too careful." "Indeed," Reverend Parker agreed, his eyes on Catherine with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "The daughters of Eve are prone to temptation. Constant supervision is essential. Perhaps I could increase my pastoral visits, help ensure she stays on the righteous path." "A generous offer. I'll consider it." Catherine forced herself to eat, to smile when expected, to nod at appropriate moments. Inside, she was screaming. But she had learned long ago that screaming changed nothing. Her father would simply explain, in his reasonable voice, why she needed correction, why isolation was for her own good, why no one would believe her anyway. After lunch, the Reverend departed with promises to return soon. Catherine's father watched his carriage roll away, then turned to his daughter with satisfaction. "You performed adequately. However, I noticed you flinched when Reverend Parker blessed you. Such displays of disrespect cannot be tolerated. I'm sorry, Father. I didn't mean. To your room. You'll spend the afternoon reflecting on proper gratitude for spiritual guidance. No dinner. You need to remember that ingratitude is a sin. Catherine climbed the stairs, her legs heavy with exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical exertion. In her room, she locked the door, not that the lock meant anything, her father had a key, and finally allowed herself to cry, silent tears that soaked her pillow. Outside, Dallas bustled with life. Inside the house on Commerce Street, a girl disappeared a little more each day, and nobody noticed because nobody looked. The afternoon sun baked the city, turning metal doorknobs hot enough to burn and making the streets shimmer with heat mirages. In Catherine's room, the air grew thick and still. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster. 27. She'd counted them thousands of times. At 4 o'clock, Mary knocked softly. "Miss Catherine, I brought you some water and I wanted to tell you something." The housekeeper's voice was barely above a whisper. "There's a lady in town, name of Mrs. Eleanor Bradshaw. She helps women who need help. I've heard talk at the market. She's staying at the Grand Hotel, room 214. I thought you should know." Catherine sat up slowly. "Why are you telling me this?" Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Because I had a daughter once, about your age, and I didn't help her when I should have. Please, Miss Catherine, please think about it." Before Catherine could respond, Mary was gone, her footsteps quick and quiet down the hallway. Room 214 at the Grand Hotel. Catherine committed the information to memory, though she couldn't imagine how she'd ever use it. She was never allowed in town unaccompanied. Her father controlled every moment of her existence. But for the first time in years, a small spark of something flickered in her chest. Not quite hope, but not quite despair either. Something in between. The evening would bring Senator Patterson and his wife, another performance in the endless theater of her life. Catherine would smile and speak when spoken to and demonstrate what a well-bred daughter looked like. And afterward, when the guests departed and the house grew dark, she would lie in her bed and listen for her father's footsteps, praying they would pass her door. But first, she had a few hours to herself. Catherine went to her window and looked out at Dallas, at the people moving freely through the streets, at the sky turning gold with the approaching sunset. Somewhere in this city was a woman who helped people like her. Somewhere there was a possibility of escape. She just had to figure out how to reach it before the cage crushed her completely. Sunday morning arrived with church bells and the smell of Mary's biscuits, both trying to convince the world that all was right in the Hartwell household. Catherine dressed in her finest, a pale yellow dress with white gloves that made her look, she thought grimly, like an Easter egg. Her father inspected her appearance with his usual thoroughness, adjusting her collar, repositioning a pin in her hair, his fingers lingering a moment too long on her neck. "Perfect," he pronounced. "Senator Patterson's wife commented on your deportment at dinner. You represented this family admirably." He handed her a Bible. "Today's sermon is on the nature of obedience. Pay close attention. I'll expect your reflections this evening." The carriage ride to First Presbyterian Church took 15 minutes through streets crowded with other families heading to worship. Catherine watched them through the window, mothers laughing with daughters, fathers swinging sons onto their shoulders, normal families doing normal things. She felt like she was observing humanity from behind glass, a specimen in a museum of her own life. Judge Hartwell nodded to acquaintances as they passed, his hand proprietarily on Catherine's arm. To anyone watching, they were the picture of paternal affection. Only Catherine felt the pressure of his grip, the subtle warning in his touch. Behave. Remember who you belong to. Remember what happens if you don't. The church was a massive stone structure, its steeple the tallest point in Dallas. proclaiming God's dominion over the city. Inside, the sanctuary smelled of lemon oil and old hymnals and the collective breath of 300 souls seeking salvation. The Hartwells had their own pew, third from the front on the right side, a position that reflected the judge's standing in the community. As they settled into their seats, Catherine felt the weight of eyes on her. Women whispered behind fans, men nodded respectfully to her father, young men stared with the kind of interest that made her want to disappear into the wooden pew. Everyone in Dallas knew the judge's daughter was of marriageable age. Everyone speculated about which lucky man would win her hand. None of them saw the cage. Reverend Parker took the pulpit with his characteristic bombast, his voice filling every corner of the sanctuary. Brothers and sisters, today we contemplate the divine order that God has established for our households. The natural hierarchy that brings peace and prosperity when followed, chaos and ruin when violated. Catherine had heard variations of this sermon dozens of times. The Reverend believed deeply in order. God above man, man above woman, parents above children. Any deviation was sinful rebellion against the Creator's plan. It was convenient theology for men like her father. Scripture tells us clearly. The Reverend's fist struck the pulpit. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is pleasing unto the Lord. The wickedness of disobedient children has brought ruin to many a godly household. Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. Beside her, her father sat with the satisfied expression of a man hearing his own beliefs confirmed by divine authority. And daughters especially must guard against willfulness. Reverend Parker was warming to his theme. The female heart is susceptible to vanity, to rebellion, to the whispers of Satan. A father's firm guidance is not cruelty. It is salvation. Better to break the body than lose the soul. Several congregants murmured, Amen. Catherine wanted to scream. After the service, the congregation gathered on the church steps for socializing. Judge Hartwell held court, discussing business and politics, while Catherine stood at his side like an ornamental sculpture. Women complimented her dress. Men commented on how well the judge had raised her. Everyone agreed she was a credit to her father. Judge Hartwell. A new voice cut through the pleasantries. Catherine looked up to see a woman she didn't recognize, elegantly dressed, perhaps 40 years old, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. I don't believe we've been introduced. Eleanor Bradshaw, newly arrived from Austin. Catherine's breath caught. This was the woman Mary had mentioned, the one who helped people. Her father's expression remained polite, but Catherine felt him tense. Mrs. Bradshaw, welcome to Dallas. What brings you to our fair city? Research, Mrs. Bradshaw said smoothly. I'm writing a book about family structures in growing Texas cities, the bonds between parents and children, the challenges of maintaining traditional values in changing times. Quite fascinating work. Her eyes shifted to Catherine. And this must be your daughter? I've heard she's the very model of proper upbringing. Catherine, her father said, his hand tightening on her arm. This is Mrs. Bradshaw. Pleased to meet you, ma'am, Catherine managed, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Charming. Mrs. Bradshaw's smile didn't reach her eyes. Judge, I wonder if I might interview your family for my book. The perspective of a respected legal figure on child rearing would be invaluable. Perhaps I could visit your home this week? Catherine saw the calculation behind her father's eyes. To refuse would seem suspicious, ungracious. But to allow this woman into his home risked exposure. I'm quite busy with court proceedings this week, he said carefully. Perhaps another time. Of course. Though I'm only in Dallas for 2 weeks, so the opportunity may pass. Mrs. Bradshaw turned to Catherine. My dear, do you ever attend the ladies' auxiliary meetings at the church? I'll be speaking there Tuesday afternoon about education for young women. Catherine opened her mouth, but her father spoke first. Catherine's schedule is quite full. I provide her education personally. How devoted you are." Something flickered in Mrs. Bradshaw's expression. "Well, should circumstances permit, the invitation stands. Good day, Judge, Miss Hartwell." She walked away, leaving Catherine feeling like she'd just watched a lifeline drift out of reach. The ride home was silent. Her father stared out the window, his jaw tight, and Catherine knew he was thinking about the encounter. Eleanor Bradshaw had seen something, recognized something, and now represented a threat to the carefully constructed facade. "That woman," he said finally, "is not welcome in our home. If she approaches you again, you will tell me immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, Father. There are people in this world who seek to destroy godly families. They spread poison disguised as concern. They encourage daughters to rebel against their fathers, wives against husbands. They are servants of chaos." His eyes fixed on her. "You will have nothing to do with her." Catherine nodded, but her mind was racing. Mrs. Bradshaw would be at the Ladies' Auxiliary on Tuesday afternoon. The church was only 6 blocks from their house. If she could somehow get there. Monday passed in the usual suffocating routine. Morning prayer, scripture study, hours alone in her room. Dinner with her father, where she ate in silence while he read legal documents. That night, lying in bed, Catherine heard his footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside her door. The handle turned slowly. Locked. A pause. Then his voice, soft and cold. "Catherine, open this door." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I was changing for bed, Father. Give me a moment." She pulled on her dressing gown with shaking hands, then unlocked the door. He stood in the hallway, his face expressionless. "You know the rules. Locked doors suggest secrecy. Secrecy suggests sin." "I'm sorry, Father. I didn't think." "That is your constant problem. You don't think." He stepped into her room, closing the door behind him. Catherine's throat constricted. "You need reminding of your position in this household." He moved closer, and Catherine backed against her desk, her mind screaming even as her body froze. This was the part she couldn't speak about, couldn't explain, because he never actually did anything that left physical marks. He just stood too close, touched too casually, looked too long, always with the veneer of paternal care. He invaded her space and her thoughts and her sense of self, and if she objected, he would ask what she was accusing him of, would suggest she had impure thoughts, would imply the sin was in her mind, not his actions. "Do you know what happens to disobedient daughters?" His voice was soft, almost gentle. "They lose their father's protection. They become vulnerable to the real evils of the world. Men who would truly harm them, use them, discard them. I keep you safe here, Catherine. You should be grateful." "I am grateful, Father." The words were automatic, a shield against the worst thing that might happen if she resisted. "Good." He reached out and adjusted her collar, his fingers brushing her collarbone. "You're growing up, Catherine. Soon you'll be married, and then you'll submit to your husband as you now submit to me. It's God's plan. Natural. Beautiful even." His hand lingered. "I'm preparing you for that life, teaching you proper obedience. Someday you'll understand." Catherine stood perfectly still, barely breathing until he finally stepped back. "Sleep well, daughter. Remember that I do this out of love." He left, closing the door behind him. Catherine listened to his footsteps retreat to his own room, then finally allowed herself to move. She stumbled to her wash basin and scrubbed her face with cold water, trying to wash away the feeling of his presence. This wasn't right. She knew that with absolute certainty. But knowing and being able to do something about it were entirely different things. Tuesday afternoon arrived like a prayer, answered by a cruel God. Catherine's father had court sessions all day, a rare occurrence that left her more unsupervised than usual. Mary was cleaning the parlor when Catherine came downstairs, her heart hammering with the audacity of what she was about to do. "Mary," she whispered, "I need to go to the church, the Ladies' Auxiliary meeting." The housekeeper's eyes widened. "Miss Catherine, your father said—" "I know what he said. But Mrs. Bradshaw will be there. Mary, please. This might be my only chance." Mary looked torn, fear and sympathy warring in her expression. Finally she nodded. "I'll tell him you felt ill and went to pray at the church, that you wanted to light a candle for your mother's soul. He might believe that." "Thank you." Catherine grabbed her shawl. "If I'm not back in 2 hours, I know." Mary's voice was heavy with sorrow. "Go, quickly." The 6 blocks to First Presbyterian felt like walking through enemy territory. Every person who saw her was a potential witness, someone who might mention to her father that his daughter had been out alone. Catherine kept her head down, her pace quick, and prayed that God, if he existed, might actually be paying attention this time. The church basement was full of women gathered for the auxiliary meeting. Catherine slipped in and took a seat in the back, her eyes searching for Eleanor Bradshaw. The older woman stood at the front, discussing educational opportunities for young ladies, her voice calm and assured. "Education provides independence," Mrs. Bradshaw was saying. "The ability to think critically, to make informed decisions about one's own life. Some would say this is dangerous for women. I say it's essential." Several women murmured agreement, though others looked scandalized. Catherine sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe. After the talk, women clustered around Mrs. Bradshaw with questions. Catherine waited, her nerves screaming at her to flee before her father discovered her absence. Finally, the crowd thinned, and Mrs. Bradshaw's eyes found hers. "Miss Hartwell, what a pleasant surprise." Catherine approached, her words tumbling out in a desperate whisper. "I need help. Please, I don't know who else to ask." Mrs. Bradshaw's expression sharpened. "Come with me." She led Catherine to a small room off the main hall, closing the door. "Tell me quickly." And Catherine did. Not everything. She couldn't bring herself to describe the worst of it, but enough. The isolation, the control, the way her father watched her. The locked rooms and biblical punishments, and the certainty that no one would believe her because Judge Theodore Hartwell was respected and righteous and powerful. "He hasn't violated you?" Mrs. Bradshaw asked carefully. "Not in the way you mean, but he makes me feel like he wants to, like he's always thinking about it. And I don't know if that's real or if I'm crazy or if—" "You're not crazy." Mrs. Bradshaw's voice was firm. "What you're describing is psychological abuse. It's real, it's harmful, and it's wrong. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" "I want to leave, but I have no money, nowhere to go, no one who would help me." "I'll help you. But we need to be smart about this. Your father has legal custody and considerable influence. Simply running away will end with him retrieving you, and then your situation will be worse." She paused. "How old are you?" 17. I turn 18 in 6 months. "Once you're 18, you're legally an adult. He can't force you to return, but 6 months is a long time to endure." A commotion erupted in the main hall. Women's voices raised in surprise and concern. Catherine's blood turned to ice. She knew, somehow she just knew, what she would see when she opened the door. Judge Theodore Hartwell stood in the church basement, his face a mask of paternal worry. "Catherine, thank God. Mary said you'd come here feeling unwell. I left court early to check on you." Every woman in the room looked at Catherine with sympathy, seeing only a devoted father concerned for his daughter's health. No one saw the rage burning behind his eyes, the promise of punishment awaiting her at home. Mrs. Bradshaw stepped forward. "Judge Hartwell, how caring of you. Your daughter simply wanted to attend our educational talk. Quite the intelligent young lady you've raised." "Indeed." His voice could have frozen water. "Catherine, the carriage is waiting. We should get you home to rest." There was no choice. Catherine nodded mutely and allowed her father to guide her outside, his hand on her elbow like a shackle. As they walked to the carriage, he leaned close and whispered, "You've made a grave mistake, daughter, a very grave mistake." The ride home took forever and no time at all. Catherine watched Dallas pass by the window and knew, with absolute certainty, that her life had just become immeasurably worse. Her father said nothing until they were inside the house, the front door closed against the world. Then he backhanded her across the face with such force she fell to the floor, tasting blood. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you could defy me and face no consequences?" He grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet. "Upstairs, now." Catherine stumbled up the stairs, her father's grip bruising. He shoved her into her room and locked the door from the outside. "You will stay here until you remember your place," he said through the door. "No food, no water. When you're ready to beg forgiveness, you may knock. Until then, reflect on your sins." His footsteps retreated down the hallway. Catherine collapsed on her bed, her face throbbing, her spirit broken. She had tried to reach for freedom and succeeded only in tightening her chains. Outside, Dallas went about its business, unaware and uncaring that in the house on Commerce Street, a girl was being slowly destroyed. 3 days passed in darkness. Judge Hartwell kept his promise. No food, no water, nothing but the 4 walls of Catherine's room and her own despair for company. Mary slipped her scraps when she could, smuggling bread and water under the cover of collecting laundry. But it wasn't enough. Catherine grew weak, her thoughts fuzzy, her body trembling. On the 4th day, her father unlocked the door. "Have you learned your lesson?" He stood in the doorway, impeccable as always, while Catherine lay on her bed looking like a ghost. "Yes, father." Her voice was a rasp. "What have you learned?" "That I am wicked, that I don't deserve your care, that I should be grateful for your guidance." The words came automatically, trained responses that kept her alive. He nodded, satisfied. "Good. Mary will bring you soup. Eat slowly." "And Catherine?" He paused. "Mrs. Bradshaw left Dallas yesterday. Whatever poison she tried to plant in your mind is gone now. You're safe again." The door closed. Catherine stared at the ceiling and tried not to cry. Mrs. Bradshaw had been her only hope, and now she was gone. Nothing had changed except that Catherine was now more carefully watched than ever. But Mary brought more than soup that evening. Tucked under the tray was a folded piece of paper. Catherine waited until she was alone to read it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, cramped and hurried. "Miss Catherine, my name is Thomas Wright. I work at your father's law office. There are things you should know about Judge Hartwell, things no one has dared speak aloud. If you want the truth, look behind the loose board beneath your bed. What you find there will give you power. Use it wisely. Burn this note." Catherine's hands shook as she held the paper over her candle flame, watching it curl into ash. Then she knelt beside her bed and felt along the floorboards. Sure enough, one was loose. She pried it up with trembling fingers. Inside the hollow space beneath was a bundle of letters tied with string. Catherine pulled them out, her heart hammering, and began to read. The first letter was dated 1894, addressed to her mother from someone named Sarah Colburn. It spoke of seeking refuge and escaping the judge's cruelty and taking her daughter to safety. The next letter was similar, from a different woman. Then another, and another. Catherine counted 12 letters total, from 12 different women, all describing abuse, control, isolation, and desperate attempts to escape Judge Theodore Hartwell. Some mentioned daughters who had disappeared. Others spoke of questionable deaths, ruled as accidents. One woman wrote, "He keeps her locked in that house like a prisoner, and when I tried to help, he destroyed my reputation and drove me from Dallas. No one will believe a word against him." The final letter made Catherine's blood run cold. It was from her mother, written weeks before she died. "My dearest sister, if you receive this, I am dead. Theodore has promised as much. He says I've become an impediment to his plans for Catherine. He's already started treating her the way he treated me. The isolation, the control, the night visits that leave no marks but destroy the soul. I tried to take her and run, but he found us before we reached the train station. He has broken my spirit but not my will to save my daughter. I've hidden evidence of his true nature beneath Catherine's room. Account books showing money paid to silence witnesses. Letters from other victims. A ledger of girls who vanished from Dallas over the past decade, all with connections to Theodore's court cases. Sister, he is not just cruel. He is evil, and he has powerful friends who help him hide his crimes. Judge Parker, Reverend Parker, they are cousins. Half the city council, they protect him because he protects them. It's a web of corruption and abuse that goes all the way to the state capitol. I can't escape. He watches me too closely. But someday Catherine will be old enough to understand, to fight. Please, if she ever reaches out to you, help her. Tell her the truth about her father. Tell her she's not alone in this horror. With love and desperation, Margaret. Catherine's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the letter. Her mother hadn't died of fever. Her father had killed her. And the abuse, the control, all of it had been happening for years to multiple women, and powerful men had covered it up. She searched the hollow beneath the floorboard again and found what her mother had described. A ledger book filled with names and dates. Mary Sutton, disappeared June 1895. Alice Warner, found drowned August 1896, ruled accidental. Rebecca Flynn, sent to an asylum December 1897, still there. On and on, a catalogue of destroyed lives, and beside many names was a note. Judge H. Matter handled. Catherine's grief transformed into something harder, colder. Rage. She understood now. Her father wasn't just abusing her. He was a predator who had operated unchecked for years, protected by his position and his allies. The night visits, the inappropriate touches, the psychological torture. It was all building towards something worse. She had seen the pattern in these letters. Girls isolated and controlled until they reached a certain age, then either married off to complicit men or disappeared. She was running out of time. Catherine heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly replaced the floorboard, hiding the letters under her mattress. Her father appeared in the doorway, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. Not as an authority figure or even a cruel parent, but as a monster wearing a human face. "You look pale, Catherine. Are you still unwell?" "Just weak from not eating, Father." She kept her voice subservient, but inside she was planning. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we have an important visitor." Marcus Brennan from Austin, a businessman, 42 years old, very successful. He's interested in marriage. Catherine's stomach dropped. "Marriage? But I'm only 17. You'll be 18 soon enough. And Mr. Brennan has been very generous in his support of my political ambitions. This is an advantageous match." His eyes glittered. "You will accept his proposal when he makes it, do you understand?" "Yes, Father." He smiled, satisfied, and left her alone. Catherine waited until the house was silent, then retrieved her mother's letter and read it again by candlelight. Her mother had known about the corruption, the web of powerful men protecting each other. That's why she hadn't been able to escape. There was nowhere to run where her father's influence couldn't reach, but her mother had also left her weapons. Evidence, names, connections. There was a knock at her window. Catherine nearly screamed before she realized someone was outside, 3 stories up. She rushed to the window and saw a young man perched precariously on the porch roof, gesturing urgently. She opened the window. "Who are you?" "Thomas Wright. I work for your father. I sent the note. We don't have much time. He could wake up any moment." "Why are you helping me?" "Because my sister was Alice Warner, the one who drowned. And I know it wasn't an accident." His eyes were hard with grief and rage. I've worked in his office for 2 years, collecting evidence, waiting for a chance to destroy him. But he's too well protected. I can't touch him without proof that even his allies can't deny. Catherine grabbed her mother's ledger. Would this be enough? Thomas's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. Jesus Christ, this is everything. Financial records, names, dates. With this we could... He stopped, looking at her carefully. What do you want, Miss Hartwell? Escape or justice? Catherine thought of her mother, murdered, of the 12 women who had written desperate letters, of all the girls whose names filled that ledger, of the future her father had planned for her, sold to another abuser to secure his political career. Justice, she said. I want to burn his whole world down. Thomas grinned, fierce and wild. Then we need to talk to someone who can't be bought. Someone with the power and the will to prosecute even a judge. He paused. There's a federal prosecutor investigating corruption in Dallas. His name is James Morrison, and he's staying at the Grand Hotel, room 3912. The Grand Hotel. Catherine felt something click into place. That's where Mrs. Bradshaw was staying. Eleanor Bradshaw is Morrison's colleague. She was gathering testimony from victims. Your father must have suspected and driven her out of town. Thomas looked at the ledger again. But with this we have what she couldn't get. Hard evidence. My father will kill me if he finds out. He'll kill you anyway, eventually. You've seen the pattern. Thomas met her eyes. I'm not going to lie and say this is safe. If we do this, we're going against some of the most powerful men in Dallas. But we can win. We can expose all of them. Catherine thought of spending one more day in this house, enduring one more night of her father's presence, living one more moment under his control. She thought of becoming another name in that ledger, another disappeared girl that Dallas would forget. How do we do it? Thomas smiled. Tomorrow night your father has a meeting with Judge Parker and Reverend Parker at the courthouse. They always meet Thursday nights to coordinate their activities. They think they're untouchable in the judge's chambers after hours. You want to catch them together? Better. I want to record their conversation. Morrison gave me a stenographer's machine. If we can get their confessions on record, combined with this ledger, we'll have enough to arrest all of them. I can't leave the house. You don't have to. I need you to do something harder. Thomas handed her a small vial. This is laudanum, a sleeping draught. Put it in your father's evening brandy. Not enough to kill him, just enough to make him sleep through the night. While he's unconscious, I'll be in his chambers recording his colleagues. By morning, we'll have everything we need. Catherine took the vial, feeling its weight like the world balanced on her palm. If you do this, Thomas warned, there's no going back. Your father will know you betrayed him. His allies will turn on you. Half of Dallas will call you a liar and worse. You'll be dragged through the mud, questioned, judged. Are you ready for that? Catherine thought of her mother's letter, of the desperate courage it must have taken to hide evidence while knowing she was going to die. Of all the women whose screams had gone unheard because powerful men had decided their suffering didn't matter. Yes, she said. I'm ready. Thomas squeezed her hand briefly. Tomorrow night, then. And Catherine, your mother would be proud of you. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Catherine alone with a vial of laudanum and a decision that would change everything. The next day dragged like torture. Catherine went through her usual routine, eating breakfast with her father, attending scripture study, pretending to be the obedient daughter he wanted. All the while, the vial burned in her pocket like a coal. Evening came. Her father dressed for his meeting, adjusting his cufflinks in the hall mirror. I'll return late tonight. You'll be asleep by then, I expect. Yes, father. Good girl. He kissed her forehead, a gesture that would have seemed loving to anyone watching but made Catherine's skin crawl. Tomorrow Mr. Brennan arrives. Make yourself presentable. He poured his customary pre-meeting brandy from the decanter in the parlor. Catherine watched from the doorway, her heart hammering. This was it, her one chance. "Father, could I have a moment to apologize for my behavior earlier this week?" He looked pleased. "Of course, daughter." Catherine approached, her hands shaking. She launched into an apology, a rambling confession of her wickedness and gratitude for his patience, keeping his attention on her while she positioned herself beside the decanter. Her hand trembled as she uncapped the vial behind her back. "I've been so foolish," she continued, and while he nodded approvingly, she dumped the laudanum into the brandy decanter. "I don't deserve your kindness." "No, you don't, but I provide it anyway." He drained his brandy glass and poured another. "Now, I must go. Reflection and prayer tonight, Catherine. Consider how blessed you are." She watched him leave, watched his carriage pull away into the Dallas twilight, and felt the weight of what she'd done settle over her like a shroud. Hours passed. Catherine paced her room, unable to eat, unable to rest. What if the dose wasn't enough? What if it was too much? What if Thomas failed to get the recordings? What if her father discovered the plot and came home early? At midnight, a small stone struck her window. Catherine opened it to find Thomas below, his face flushed with triumph. "We got them," he whispered urgently. "Everything. Parker and the Reverend were drunk and bragging about their crimes. They think they're invincible. It's all on record. The bribes, the cover-ups, the girls they've hurt. Morrison has enough to bring federal charges against all of them." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. "It's really over?" "Not yet. Your father will come home soon. The laudanum should keep him unconscious until morning, but we need you out of this house before he wakes up. Morrison has a safe place prepared. We leave now. Mary, the housekeeper, already gone. Morrison's men got her out an hour ago. She's safe." Catherine grabbed her mother's letters and the ledger, wrapping them in a shawl. She took one last look at the room that had been her prison for so many years, then climbed out the window onto the porch roof. The night air smelled of honeysuckle and freedom. Thomas helped her down to the ground, and together they ran through the darkness toward the Grand Hotel, toward safety, toward the moment when the truth would finally be spoken aloud. Behind them, the house on Commerce Street stood silent and dark, waiting for the morning when its secrets would be dragged into the light. But Catherine didn't know, couldn't know, that the most devastating truth was still waiting to be uncovered. That her father's evil went deeper than abuse and murder. That the rot at the heart of Dallas would take more than one night to expose. The real story was just beginning. Morning broke over Dallas like a judgment. Catherine woke in a small room at the Grand Hotel, sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows, and for a moment couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back. The escape, Thomas Wright, the recording, her father's crimes laid bare. She dressed quickly and found federal prosecutor James Morrison waiting in the hotel's private sitting room, a stern man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much corruption. "Miss Hartwell." He stood when she entered. "We need to discuss what happens next. Thomas showed me your mother's evidence. Combined with last night's recordings, we have enough to arrest your father and his associates. But," he paused heavily, "this will be the biggest prosecution Dallas has ever seen. Judge Hartwell has powerful friends. The trial will be vicious." "I don't care," Catherine said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Tell me what to do." "First, you need to understand what you're up against. Your father's corruption isn't just personal abuse. It's part of a larger system. He's been taking bribes for years, throwing cases, protecting criminals in exchange for money and political favors. Judge Parker and Reverend Parker are part of it. So are 3 members of the city council, the police chief, and at least a dozen prominent businessmen. Catherine felt the room spin. That's why no one would help. They're all in on it. Exactly. Which means when we move against your father, we're moving against half the power structure in Dallas. They will fight back with everything they have. They'll attack your credibility, your character, your sanity. They'll say you're a hysterical girl seeking attention. They'll drag your reputation through the mud. Let them try. Catherine lifted her chin. I have my mother's ledger. 12 women who tried to escape. Names, dates, payments made to silence them. And I have the recording from last night. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's the spirit we'll need. Thomas, bring in Mrs. Bradshaw. Eleanor Bradshaw entered, looking tired but determined. When she saw Catherine, her face softened with relief. Thank God you're safe. I've been collecting testimony from the women in that ledger, the ones still alive. 4 of them have agreed to testify, including Mary, your housekeeper. What about the others? 3 are dead. Suspicious circumstances in all cases. 2 are in asylums. We're trying to get them released to testify. 1 disappeared without a trace, and 2 refused to come forward. They're too frightened of retaliation. Catherine absorbed this. When do we arrest my father? This morning. We're waiting for the federal marshals to arrive from Austin. They'll take him into custody at his home. Morrison pulled out his pocket watch. In about 2 hours. Those 2 hours felt like years. Catherine sat in the hotel room, unable to eat, while Morrison and his team finalized their strategy. Thomas kept her company, explaining what would happen at the trial. Your father will hire the best lawyers money can buy. They'll try to discredit the evidence, claim the ledger is forged, say the recording is inadmissible. They'll attack you personally. They'll say you're an ungrateful daughter seeking revenge for normal discipline. I know, Catherine said quietly. But I also know what he did to my mother, to those other women, to me. Someone has to speak the truth. At 10 o'clock, a messenger arrived with news. Judge Theodore Hartwell had been arrested at his home, along with Judge Parker and Reverend Josiah Parker. All 3 were now in federal custody, charged with conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of abuse and murder. The news spread through Dallas like wildfire. By noon, crowds had gathered outside the courthouse. The Dallas Morning News ran an emergency edition with the headline, Prominent Judge Arrested in Corruption Scandal. But Catherine wasn't prepared for the backlash. Within hours, the counter-narrative began. The Evening Post, owned by one of her father's business partners, published an editorial calling the charges a witch hunt against a respected family man and describing Catherine as a troubled young woman prone to delusions. Women she'd known from church gave interviews saying she'd always seemed odd and disrespectful. Even some of her father's victims, terrified of the power structure, publicly denied their letters, claiming they'd been taken out of context. This is what we expected, Morrison said grimly as they reviewed the evening papers. The establishment is closing ranks. But we have the evidence. We just need to get it in front of a jury. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 days later. Catherine spent those days preparing her testimony, reviewing her mother's documents, trying to steel herself for what was coming. Mrs. Bradshaw stayed with her, a steady presence in the chaos. They'll try to destroy you on the stand, Eleanor warned. Your father's lawyers will question everything, your motives, your memory, your mental state. You need to stay calm and stick to the facts. What if I break down? Then you break down. Showing emotion isn't weakness, it's human. But don't let them twist your words. Answer only what's asked. Don't elaborate. And remember, you're not on trial. He is. The morning of the hearing, Dallas woke to a city divided. Pro-Hartwell demonstrations gathered outside the courthouse, carrying signs that read, "Defend our judges," and "False accusations ruin lives." But there was a smaller counter-demonstration too. Women in plain clothes, holding candles, standing in silent witness. Catherine recognized one of them, Mrs. Sarah Colburn, whose letter had been in her mother's bundle. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Sarah nodded once, firm and sad and brave. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled, people standing in the back, reporters jostling for position. Catherine took her seat behind the prosecution table and forced herself to look at her father. Judge Theodore Hartwell sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking every inch the wronged innocent. His lawyers, 3 of them, including the most famous defense attorney in Texas, surrounded him like guards. When his eyes found Catherine's, she saw no remorse, only cold, calculating rage. The judge presiding over the hearing was brought in from outside Dallas, a federal judge named Martha Holloway, a stern woman known for her fairness. She surveyed the circus her courtroom had become with obvious distaste. "This is a preliminary hearing to determine if there is sufficient evidence to proceed to trial," Judge Holloway announced. "Prosecutor Morrison, present your case." Morrison stood. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Theodore Hartwell, along with his associates Judge Parker and Reverend Josiah Parker, operated a criminal conspiracy spanning over a decade. They abused their positions of power to prey on vulnerable women and girls, to take bribes to obstruct justice, and in at least 3 cases, to murder witnesses who threatened to expose them." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Hartwell's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Beauregard Preston, shot to his feet. "Objection. These are inflammatory accusations. Mr. Preston, this is not the trial. Sit down." Judge Holloway's voice cut like a knife. "Continue, Mr. Morrison." Morrison presented the evidence methodically. The ledger with its damning entries, testimony from Thomas Wright about the financial records, the recording from Thursday night's meeting. When the recorded voices of Judge Parker and Reverend Parker played in the courtroom, laughing about handling problems and keeping the girls quiet, the crowd erupted. "Order!" Judge Holloway's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "I will clear this courtroom if necessary." Then it was time for Catherine to testify. She walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like water, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The whole truth. Nothing but the truth. Morrison's questions were gentle, leading her through her story. The isolation, the control, her father's inappropriate behavior, her mother's death, the discovery of the evidence. Catherine kept her voice steady, stated the facts clearly, refused to cry even when describing the worst of it. Then Beauregard Preston stood for cross-examination, and Catherine understood why her father had hired him. He was a predator in a different form, elegant, charming, and absolutely ruthless. "Miss Hartwell, you claim your father abused you. Yet I see no scars, no broken bones, no evidence of physical harm. Isn't that curious? The abuse was psychological. Ah, psychological. How convenient. Impossible to prove, easy to fabricate." Preston smiled like a shark. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell, do you have any history of mental instability?" "Objection." Morrison was on his feet. "Relevance?" "Your Honor, if this witness has a history of delusions or attention-seeking behavior, it speaks to her credibility." Judge Holloway frowned. "I'll allow it. But tread carefully, Mr. Preston." "Thank you, Your Honor." "Miss Hartwell." Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. "I am not mentally unstable. Yet you've been isolated for years, homeschooled by your father with limited social contact. Isn't it possible you've misinterpreted his paternal concern as something sinister? That your sheltered upbringing has led to an overactive imagination?" "No." "No?" Preston raised an eyebrow. "A simple answer. Let me ask you this. Did your father ever explicitly tell you he intended to harm you? Not in those words, but yes or no, please." "Not explicitly, but his actions. Yes or no, Miss Hartwell." Catherine saw the trap, but couldn't avoid it. "No, not explicitly. So you're interpreting his actions through your own lens, deciding what he meant, what he intended, without any direct evidence." Preston paced before the jury. "Isn't it true that you recently tried to run away? That you went to hear Mrs. Eleanor Bradshaw speak against your father's wishes?" "Yes, but—" "And your father, concerned for your welfare, retrieved you. Like any worried parent would, he locked me in my room for 3 days without food. According to you, are there any witnesses to this alleged punishment?" Catherine hesitated. Mary had seen her condition, but Mary was also testifying for the prosecution. Preston would just claim they'd coordinated their stories. The housekeeper who is also making accusations against my client? How convenient that she corroborates your story. Preston leaned forward. Miss Hartwell, isn't it true that you drugged your father the night before his arrest? That you admitted to putting laudanum in his brandy? Catherine's blood ran cold. How did he know? Yes. So you're confessing to a crime, drugging someone without their knowledge or consent. That's assault, Miss Hartwell. You're a criminal. Objection. Morrison slammed his hand on the table. Mr. Preston is testifying rather than questioning. Sustained. Mr. Preston, rephrase. But the damage was done. Catherine saw the jury's faces shifting, doubt creeping in. Preston pressed his advantage. Miss Hartwell, you claim to have evidence of your father's crimes, a ledger kept by your deceased mother. But your mother died 7 years ago. Why did you wait until now to reveal this evidence? I only found it recently. She hid it beneath my floor. How convenient. And we're supposed to believe that in 7 years you never once discovered this hidden evidence? That you magically found it just when you needed it most? Preston shook his head sadly. Miss Hartwell, I suggest that you fabricated this entire story. That you created a fake ledger, collaborated with Thomas Wright, a known troublemaker, and recorded an innocent meeting between your father and his colleagues, editing it to sound incriminating. All because you're an ungrateful, rebellious child who resents her father's proper discipline. That's not true. Catherine's voice cracked. My father is a monster. He killed my mother. He's been abusing women for years. Or, Preston said softly, you're a disturbed young woman who has convinced herself of a fantasy, who needs psychiatric help, not a courtroom. He turned to Judge Holloway. No further questions. Catherine stumbled back to her seat, feeling like she'd been flayed alive. Morrison squeezed her shoulder. You did well. He's trying to create doubt, but the physical evidence stands. The hearing lasted 3 more days. The prosecution called witness after witness. The women from the ledger who were brave enough to testify. Thomas Wright with his financial records. Even Mary describing what she'd seen in the Hartwell household. The recording was played again and analyzed by experts who confirmed it hadn't been edited or manipulated. But the defense countered every piece of evidence. They brought in handwriting experts who suggested the ledger could have been forged. They claimed the recording was taken out of context. They paraded character witnesses who swore Judge Hartwell was a pillar of the community, incapable of such crimes. And they attacked the women who testified, painting them as scorned, mentally unstable, or seeking financial gain. One witness broke down sobbing on the stand after Preston suggested her testimony was motivated by a grudge over a custody case Judge Hartwell had ruled against her years ago. By the time Judge Holloway called for final arguments, Catherine felt like Dallas itself was on trial, and she was losing. Morrison's closing was passionate. Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. We have financial records, testimony from multiple victims, and a recorded confession. The defense wants you to believe this is all an elaborate conspiracy, but the simplest explanation is the truth. Theodore Hartwell is guilty. Preston's rebuttal was masterful. Your Honor, what we have here is the tragedy of a broken family. A daughter who resents her father's strictness, allies with a vengeful employee, and manufactures a scandal to destroy a good man. Yes, Judge Hartwell was strict, but strict parenting is not abuse. Being a demanding father is not a crime. The prosecution asks you to ruin a man's life based on the word of a teenage girl with an admitted history of drugging her own father. I urge you to see this for what it is. A witch hunt. Judge Holloway took 2 days to deliberate. When she returned to the courtroom, her face revealed nothing. I've reviewed all the evidence presented at this hearing. The ledger, the financial records, the testimony of witnesses, and the recorded conversation. She paused. While the defense has raised questions about the credibility of some evidence, I find sufficient grounds to proceed to trial. Theodore Hartwell, Judge Aaron Parker, and Reverend Josiah Parker will face trial on all charges. Trial date is set for 6 weeks from today. Bail is denied. The courtroom erupted. Half the crowd cheered, half booed. Theodore Hartwell's face went purple with rage as federal marshals led him away in handcuffs. His eyes found Catherine one last time, and the promise she saw there chilled her to the bone. This isn't over. Outside the courthouse, Catherine faced a mob of reporters. Flashbulbs popped in her face. Questions were shouted from all directions. Miss Hartwell, do you regret turning on your father? Is it true you're seeking control of his fortune? What do you say to people calling you a liar? Mrs. Bradshaw pushed through the crowd, shielding Catherine. No comment. Let us through. They made it back to the Grand Hotel, where Morrison was already planning trial strategy. The preliminary hearing was just the opening act, he warned. The actual trial will be 10 times worse. Preston will bring in expert witnesses, psychiatrists, character witnesses. He'll try to paint your father as the victim and you as the villain. But we won, Catherine said weakly. We're going to trial. Going to trial isn't the same as winning. A jury trial means 12 people from Dallas, people who've been reading the newspapers, hearing the gossip, absorbing the narrative that you're an ungrateful daughter. We need to prepare for every possible attack. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face grim. There's something else. The Evening Post just published an interview with Marcus Brennan, the businessman your father wanted you to marry. He says you agreed to the engagement, then broke it off after fabricating these accusations. He's claiming breach of promise and demanding damages. Catherine felt the walls closing in. I never agreed to anything. I'd never even met the man. I know. But he's adding to the narrative that you're vindictive and untrustworthy. Thomas handed her the newspaper. It gets worse. There's a petition circulating to have you examined by psychiatrists. Some women's groups are claiming you're suffering from hysteria and need to be institutionalized for your own protection. They're trying to lock me up in an asylum. They're trying to discredit you before trial. If they can get a court order declaring you mentally unfit, your testimony becomes worthless. Morrison swore under his breath. We need to counter this. Catherine, would you be willing to submit to a psychiatric evaluation by a doctor we trust? Someone who can testify that you're perfectly sane? Catherine wanted to scream. She'd escaped her father's house, only to find herself trapped in a different kind of prison, the court of public opinion, where her sanity, her character, her very worth as a person was constantly questioned. Yes, she said finally, I'll do whatever it takes. Over the next 6 weeks, Catherine lived in a strange limbo. She stayed at the Grand Hotel under assumed names, moving rooms every few days for safety after receiving death threats. She met with psychiatrists who poked and prodded at her psyche. She prepared for trial with Morrison's team, rehearsing her testimony until she could recite it in her sleep. And every day she read the newspapers, watching her life become a spectacle for Dallas to debate. Some papers painted her as a hero, a brave daughter exposing corruption. Others called her the ungrateful harpy or the rebellious daughter, and questioned why any father would be prosecuted for proper discipline. The women who had testified at the preliminary hearing faced consequences too. Sarah Colburn's landlord evicted her. Another woman lost her job. Mary received threats that drove her into hiding. The message was clear. Speaking out against powerful men came at a cost. But there were bright spots too. Letters began arriving at the hotel from women across Texas, sharing their own stories of abuse and thanking Catherine for her courage. A defense fund was established, and donations poured in from suffragettes and reform groups. Slowly, a counter-narrative began to form. This wasn't just about one family, but about the systemic abuse of power that affected women everywhere. The night before the trial began, Catherine couldn't sleep. She stood at her hotel window, looking out at Dallas stretched beneath the stars, and thought about her mother. Margaret Hartwell had tried to save her, had hidden evidence even while knowing it would cost her life. Now Catherine was carrying that torch forward, and she wouldn't fail. A knock at the door. Thomas Wright entered, looking exhausted but determined. "I wanted to check on you before tomorrow. Are you ready? I don't know if anyone can be ready for this. For what it's worth, I believe you. And I believe we're going to win." He handed her an envelope. "This came for you today. It's from your mother's sister, your aunt in Houston. She saw the news and wanted to reach out." Catherine opened the letter with shaking hands. "Dearest Catherine, your mother was my sister and my best friend. When she died, I knew in my heart that Theodore was responsible, but I had no proof and no power to act. Seeing you stand up to him, exposing his crimes, makes me weep with pride and grief. You are your mother's daughter, brave, strong, refusing to be broken. Whatever the trial brings, know that you have family who loves you. When this is over, you have a home with me in Houston. You're not alone. With love, Aunt Elizabeth." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. The first tears she'd allowed herself since the escape. She wasn't alone. She had allies, family, a future beyond this courtroom battle. "Thank you," she told Thomas, "for everything, for believing me, for helping me fight." "Thank my sister," he said quietly. "Alice didn't get justice, but maybe we can get it for her memory, and for all the others." The next morning, Catherine walked into the courtroom with her head high, ready to face whatever came. The trial of Theodore Hartwell was about to begin, and Dallas would finally hear the truth, even if it destroyed her in the process. The trial lasted 4 weeks and consumed Dallas like a fever. Every day, crowds packed the courthouse, reporters filled notebooks, and the city held its collective breath. Catherine testified for 3 days straight, enduring cross-examination that felt more like an inquisition. Beauregard Preston attacked from every angle, but she held firm, telling her story again and again until even the hostile newspapers had to acknowledge her consistency. The prosecution called their witnesses, the women from the Ledger, each one braver than the last. Thomas Wright presented financial evidence of bribes and payoffs. Experts testified about the recording's authenticity. Morrison built his case brick by brick, constructing an undeniable monument to Theodore Hartwell's guilt. But the defense had resources too. They brought in psychiatrists who had never met Catherine, but diagnosed her with hysteria and delusions. Character witnesses swore Judge Hartwell was incapable of such crimes. Ministers testified to his deep faith and charitable works. It became a battle between 2 versions of reality, and the jury would have to decide which one was true. On the 23rd day of trial, something unexpected happened. A woman named Victoria Monroe took the stand for the defense, prepared to testify about Judge Hartwell's excellent character. She was a society matron, wife of a prominent banker, and known for her charity work. But when Preston asked her to describe Hartwell's reputation, she paused. "I came here prepared to defend Judge Hartwell," she said slowly. "But I've been sitting in this courtroom for 3 weeks listening to the testimony, and I realize I can't do it." The courtroom went dead silent. Preston's face turned ashen. "Mrs. Monroe, please just answer, no." Victoria Monroe turned to face the jury directly. 20 years ago, my younger sister worked as a clerk in Judge Hartwell's office. She was 16. She came home crying one day, saying he'd touched her inappropriately, made suggestions. My parents were furious, but when they tried to report it, they were told there was no evidence. Judge Hartwell's friends rallied around him. My sister's reputation was destroyed. She killed herself 6 months later. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Judge Holloway banged her gavel, but Mrs. Monroe continued. "I convinced myself it wasn't his fault, that my sister had misunderstood. because it was easier than believing a respected judge was a predator. But listening to these women, hearing their stories, it's my sister's story. The same pattern, the same abuse, the same protective wall of powerful men. Tears streamed down her face. I can't stay silent anymore. Judge Hartwell destroyed my family, and I helped him by saying nothing. I won't do that again. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Preston was shouting objections. Morrison was on his feet, demanding Mrs. Monroe be allowed to continue. Judge Holloway called for order, but the damage or the truth was already out. Victoria Monroe's testimony changed everything. She wasn't a paid witness or someone with a grudge. She was a pillar of Dallas society, and her breaking ranks created a crack in the wall of silence. Over the next 2 days, 3 more women came forward with similar stories, each one emboldened by Mrs. Monroe's courage. The tide was turning. On the final day of trial, Morrison gave his closing argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard weeks of testimony. You've seen the evidence. You've heard from brave women who risked everything to tell the truth. The defense wants you to believe this is all a conspiracy. But I ask you, what's more likely? That a dozen women coordinated an elaborate hoax? Or that a powerful man with protection from his allies got away with abuse for years until his own daughter finally exposed him? He paused, letting the question hang. Theodore Hartwell is guilty. Judge Parker is guilty. Reverend Parker is guilty. They used their positions to prey on the vulnerable, to silence witnesses, to corrupt justice itself. Your verdict will answer a simple question. Does power put you above the law? Or does the law apply to everyone, even judges? Preston's closing was desperate. He attacked the witnesses' credibility, suggested financial motives, painted Theodore Hartwell as a victim of modern hysteria about women's rights. But even he seemed to know he was losing. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the mechanical recitation of arguments that sounded hollow in the face of so much testimony. The jury deliberated for 36 hours. Catherine spent that time in a fog of anxiety, unable to eat or sleep, pacing her hotel room while Thomas and Mrs. Bradshaw kept watch. Every hour that passed felt like torture. What if the jury acquitted? What if everything had been for nothing? On the second day, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was so packed people stood in the aisles. Catherine took her seat, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles went white. Theodore Hartwell sat at the defense table, his face carved from stone, refusing to even glance at his daughter. Judge Holloway entered. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood, a middle-aged shopkeeper named John Mitchell. We have, Your Honor. In the matter of Theodore Hartwell, on the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, how do you find? Guilty. The courtroom exploded. Judge Holloway's gavel cracked like thunder. Order. I will have order. On the charge of accepting bribes? Guilty. On the charge of abuse of power? Guilty. Count after count, the same answer. Guilty. 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 And finally, on the charge that mattered most to Catherine, on the charge of murder in the death of Margaret Hartwell, the foreman's voice rang clear. Guilty. Catherine collapsed into her seat, sobbing. It was over. After everything, the abuse, the fear, the trial, the attacks on her character, it was finally over. Her father was guilty. The jury had believed her. Judge Holloway sentenced Theodore Hartwell to 20 years in prison. Judge Parker got 15, Reverend Josiah Parker got 10. The sentences would be served in federal prison, far from Dallas and the corrupt system that had protected them. As marshals led the defendants away, Theodore Hartwell finally looked at Catherine. She expected rage or hatred, but what she saw was worse, complete indifference. She had won, but to him she still didn't matter. She was still nothing. But she realized something in that moment. His opinion of her didn't matter anymore. She had broken free. She had told the truth. She had survived. And that was everything. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some threw things and shouted insults, but others cheered. Women wept and thanked her. Reporters called her the bravest woman in Texas. Catherine stood on those courthouse steps, blinking in the bright Dallas sun, and felt like she could finally breathe. Mrs. Bradshaw put an arm around her shoulders. "What will you do now?" Catherine thought about her aunt's letter, about Houston and a new life. She thought about all the women whose stories had been silenced, who deserved to be heard. She thought about justice and healing and the long road ahead. "I'm going to live," she said simply. "Really live. For me, for my mother, for everyone who couldn't escape." She looked at the crowd, at the women who had stood witness. "And I'm going to help others do the same." The reformation of Dallas began that day. The corruption scandal led to investigations of dozens of city officials. The police chief resigned. 3 city council members were arrested. The network of powerful men who had protected each other began to crumble, and in its place, something new started to grow. Catherine moved to Houston to live with her aunt, but she returned to Dallas often to testify in related cases, to speak at women's gatherings, to share her story. She became an advocate for victims of abuse, working with Mrs. Bradshaw to establish safe houses and legal aid for women trying to escape dangerous situations. Thomas Wright stayed in Dallas and became an investigative reporter, exposing corruption wherever he found it. Mary, the housekeeper, opened a boarding house specifically for women fleeing abuse, funded by donations from supporters across Texas. The house on Commerce Street was sold at auction. Catherine couldn't bear to keep it, couldn't bear to profit from the place where so much suffering had occurred. The money went to victims' advocacy groups. The new owners tore down the mansion and built something new, a library, open to all, with a reading room dedicated to Margaret Hartwell's memory. 5 years later, on a warm spring day in 1906, Catherine stood in that library, speaking to a room full of young women about the importance of education and independence. She was 22 now, enrolled in university studying law. She'd never married, had no interest in marriage. She had her own life, her own purpose, her own voice. After the talk, a young girl approached her, maybe 14, with frightened eyes and bruises she tried to hide. "Miss Hartwell, I need help. My father, he's like yours was, and I don't know what to do." Catherine took the girl's hand and held it firmly. "You're going to be okay. I'm going to help you. You're not alone." And she meant it, because that was the promise she'd made to herself when she stood on those courthouse steps 5 years ago. No girl would ever be alone in that darkness again, not if Catherine could help it. Dallas had changed. The fever of corruption had broken, and while the city still had its problems, still had its powerful men and its secret sins, it could no longer claim ignorance. The trial had forced everyone to look at the rot beneath the respectable surface, to acknowledge that evil didn't just exist in saloons and brothels, but in judges' chambers and church pews. The women who had testified became unlikely heroes. Sarah Colburn started a newspaper dedicated to women's issues. Victoria Monroe used her society connections to fund educational programs for poor girls. Even the women who had initially denied their stories, who had been too frightened to speak, slowly began to come forward, adding their voices to the chorus demanding change. Catherine's story became legend, told and retold, sometimes accurately and sometimes not. Some versions made her a saint, others still called her a troublemaker. She didn't care about either version. She knew her truth. She was a survivor who had found her voice and refused to be silenced. On quiet nights, she still thought about her father, about the monster he'd been and the lies he'd hidden behind. She thought about her mother, buried in Dallas Cemetery under a stone that now bore the inscription, Margaret Hartwell, 1869-1894. Beloved wife and mother, her truth prevailed. Catherine visited the grave monthly, bringing flowers and telling her mother about the work she was doing. "I hope I'm making you proud," she whispered during one visit. I hope you can see what your courage started. How many women are safe now because you hid that evidence?" The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and Catherine chose to believe it was her mother's answer. Catherine's story didn't end with a trial verdict. It continued in every woman she helped, every girl who learned that abuse wasn't love, every survivor who found the courage to speak. The house on Commerce Street was gone, but its lesson remained. Behind the most respectable facades, evil can flourish. And sometimes the only thing standing between a predator and his victims is one person brave enough to tell the truth, no matter the cost. Dallas remembered Judge Theodore Hartwell, but not in the way he'd intended. His name became synonymous with corruption and abuse of power. His downfall became a cautionary tale about what happens when society looks away from suffering because it's convenient. And his daughter became the symbol of something he'd tried to destroy. A woman with agency, autonomy, and an unshakable certainty that her voice mattered. Catherine Hartwell lived to see the world change in ways her mother could never have imagined. Women won the right to vote. Laws were passed protecting children from abuse. The casual cruelties her father had inflicted became recognized crimes instead of private family matters. But she never forgot the girls who hadn't escaped. The names in her mother's ledger who had no happy endings. She carried them with her always, a reminder that her freedom had been built on their suffering, and that honoring their memory meant ensuring no one else would share their fate. 20 years after the trial, on the anniversary of her father's conviction, Catherine returned to Dallas one last time. The city barely recognized her. She'd cut her hair short in the modern fashion, wore trousers instead of dresses, and carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had stared down monsters and won. She walked past where the house on Commerce Street had stood, now transformed into a library full of light and life and knowledge freely shared. She visited her mother's grave and laid white roses on the stone. She met with the women's advocacy group she'd helped found, now run by a new generation who didn't remember the trial but understood its importance. And then she did something she'd never done before. She forgave herself. For all the years she'd stayed silent. For not being able to save her mother. For surviving when others hadn't. She understood finally that she'd been a child in an impossible situation and that her survival, and what she'd done with it, was enough. "I lived," she whispered to the Dallas sky, to the ghost of her father, to the memory of her mother. "Despite everything you did to destroy me, I lived, and I helped others live too. That's my victory. That's my justice." The sun set over Dallas, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and Catherine smiled. She had a train to catch, a life waiting for her in Houston, students who needed teaching, cases that required her legal expertise, and a world that was slowly, painfully, learning to see women as human beings deserving of dignity and safety. The story that began in darkness ended in light. Not perfect light. There were still shadows, still battles to fight, still predators who thought power made them untouchable. But Catherine had proven they were wrong. She had shown that even the most powerful man could fall if his victims refused to stay silent. And across Texas, in houses where girls were suffering in secret, her story gave them hope. Escape was possible. Justice was possible. And on the other side of that darkness was a life worth fighting for. The house on Commerce Street was gone, but its legacy lived in every woman who heard Catherine's story and decided she deserved better. In every girl who recognized abuse and knew she had the right to name it. In every survivor who understood that shame belonged to the abuser, not the abused. Dallas had been forced to reckon with its complicity, and though the city would never be perfect, it was better than it had been. The trial of Theodore Hartwell had cracked open a conversation that spread far beyond one courtroom, changing laws and lives across the state and eventually the nation. Catherine Hartwell, the judge's daughter who had never been allowed to scream, had found her voice and used it to shatter the silence that protected predators. In doing so, she'd become something her father had never anticipated, not a victim, not a possession, but a force for change that would outlive them both. And in the end, that was the sweetest victory of all. Now I don't have good news. I love to produce these videos, but creating them takes me a lot of time, and the only way I have to continue is to reach 1,000 subscribers, because this way I start receiving from YouTube. If you like our stories, do not let this channel die. Subscribe and share our videos, since I am grateful